When neighbors reached the Patterson Hollow 3 days after the storm that struck on February 8, 1867, had cleared, they found the family, Daniel and Martha Patterson, and their 4 children, alive but profoundly changed by whatever had occurred during the 3 nights they had spent confined in their cabin while wind moved through the hollow in ways that wind should not move, while sounds came from outside and from within the walls that had no source that could be identified, and while the distinction between natural storm phenomena and something else became impossible for the family to maintain. The Pattersons were physically unharmed, showed no signs of injury or illness or deprivation, and had adequate food and warmth throughout the storm's duration. But they refused to remain in the hollow, refused to spend another night in the cabin where the wind had spoken, refused to return to the property they had worked for 6 years. Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing episodes of environmental psychological horror ever documented in the Ozark Plateau. In the years when winter storms could create wind conditions that lasted for days, and when isolated hollows could channel wind in ways that created unusual acoustic effects, when frontier families understood that wind made sounds, but also understood that some sounds required explanation beyond simple physics of air moving through gaps, when the line between natural phenomenon and something else was determined not by what happened, but by how what happened affected those who experienced it, and by whether they could continue living in the place where the experience occurred, there lived a family who spent 3 nights listening to wind that seemed to speak, who heard sounds that seemed to have pattern and purpose beyond what random air movement should create, and who left their hollow permanently because whatever they heard during those 3 nights made remaining impossible, even though leaving meant abandoning everything they had built, and even though they could not explain to others what they had heard in ways that would make their departure seem reasonable, rather than seem like the result of fear that had no rational basis. Leave a comment where you're watching from as we trace the boundary between wind that makes noise and wind that makes noise that sounds like language, between acoustic phenomena that can be explained and acoustic phenomena that resist explanation, because what is heard exceeds what physics alone should create. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Before we enter that hollow and listen to 3 nights of wind that seemed to speak, consider what wind sounds meant to frontier families and why experienced residents understood that wind created noise, but that some noise exceeded what wind alone should create. Wind moving through structures made predictable sounds, whistling through gaps, rattling shutters, creaking wood under pressure, sounds that were unsettling but that were understood to be mechanical results of air pressure and vibration. These sounds could be loud, could persist for hours during sustained storms, and could create anxiety through their constancy and their volume. But they were sounds that had explanations, that could be traced to sources, that made sense within frameworks of how wind interacted with buildings. But occasionally, wind created sounds that exceeded these frameworks, sounds that seemed to have pattern beyond what random turbulence should create, sounds that seemed to have rhythm or cadence that suggested intention rather than accident, sounds that affected listeners in ways that simple noise should not affect them, by creating impressions of meaning or of purpose that made the sounds feel like communication rather than merely like environmental noise. These sounds were rare enough that most people never experienced them, were difficult to describe to those who had not heard them, and created effects on those who did hear them that ranged from mere unease to profound psychological disturbance that made remaining in the location where the sounds occurred impossible even after the wind that created them had stopped. The Patterson family, Daniel, age 39, Martha, age 36, and their 4 children, Samuel, age 13, Rebecca, age 10, William, age 7, and Anna, age 4, had lived in their hollow approximately 9 miles southeast of what would eventually become Gainesville, Missouri, since 1861. The hollow was a narrow valley enclosed by steep ridges on 3 sides, with a single access trail that connected it to more commonly traveled routes. The enclosed nature of the hollow made it sheltered from some weather, but also made it a trap for other weather. Wind that entered the hollow through the open end could not easily escape through the closed end, could circulate and build and create effects that open terrain would not create. The Pattersons had chosen the hollow because it provided good land for farming, provided water from a spring that ran year-round, and provided the kind of isolation that some families preferred. Through their first 5 years in the hollow, they had experienced no unusual difficulties. Winters were cold, storms were sometimes severe, and wind in the hollow was often stronger and more sustained than wind in open areas. But these were manageable challenges that frontier life required managing, and that the family had managed successfully. The winter of 1866 to 1867 had been typical through December and January. Cold weather, snow that accumulated and melted in normal patterns, storms that came and went as seasons required. The Patterson family had survived these months without unusual incident, and had no reason to expect that February would bring anything different from what previous Februaries had brought. On the morning of February 8th, 1867, Daniel Patterson observed approaching weather that suggested a significant storm was coming. The sky was heavy with dark clouds that extended from horizon to horizon. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the wind was beginning to increase in ways that indicated the storm would bring not just snow, but sustained high winds that would persist through the storm's duration. These signs were familiar. Winter storms in the Ozarks often brought these conditions, and Daniel had experienced similar storms many times during his 6 years in the hollow. He spent the day preparing, securing items around the homestead that wind might damage, bringing in extra firewood, checking that the cabin was as weatherproof as possible. Martha prepared food that could be eaten cold if necessary, checked that lamps had adequate oil, and made sure the children understood that they would likely be confined to the cabin for several days while the storm passed. The preparations were routine, were based on experience with previous storms, and reflected a family that understood winter weather and that managed it competently. The storm arrived in the early evening of February 8th. Snow began falling heavily, and wind began blowing with force that was substantial even by the standards of the hollow, where wind was always stronger than in open terrain. The family settled into their cabin, maintained fire in the stove, and began the process of waiting out the storm in ways that frontier families had developed through necessity and through experience. The first, night, February 8th into February 9th, was difficult, but not exceptional. The wind was loud, was constant, and created sounds that made sleep difficult, and that made conversation inside the cabin require raised voices. But the sounds were the sounds that wind made: whistling, howling, rattling, creaking. Sounds that were unpleasant, but that were understood to be normal consequences of sustained high wind moving around and through a structure. The family endured the night, slept in fragments when the noise allowed sleep, and woke on the morning of February 9th, tired but intact, and expecting that the storm would continue for at least another day, and possibly longer, based on how the weather appeared through the cabin's small windows. The second day, February 9th, brought continued storm. Snow accumulated, wind persisted, and the family remained confined. The children were restless from confinement. The parents were tired from poor sleep, but the situation remained manageable and remained within the range of what frontier families expected to endure during winter storms. By evening of February 9th, the family prepared for another night of wind and noise, prepared to endure another night of difficult sleep and constant sound, prepared to wait for the storm to end as storms always eventually ended. But the second night, February 9th into February 10th, was different. The wind that had been merely loud on the first night became something else on the second night. The sounds that had been explainable on the first night became sounds that Daniel and Martha found increasingly difficult to explain as the second night progressed. The change was not dramatic. There was no single moment when the wind transformed from natural to unnatural, but gradual, progressive, a slow recognition that what they were hearing was not quite right, was not quite what wind alone should create, was beginning to sound like something beyond simple air movement and vibration. The first indication came around midnight. Daniel, lying awake because sleep in the noise was impossible, noticed that the wind seemed to have developed a pattern, not a consistent pattern, but recurring elements that suggested the randomness of turbulence was creating sequences that repeated more often than pure randomness should create repetition. He listened more carefully, trying to determine if the pattern was real or if his tired mind was finding pattern where none existed, because minds under stress often found patterns in random data. But the more he listened, the more he became convinced that something in the wind's sound was repeating, was cycling through variations that returned to similar configurations, often enough to seem non-random. He did not mention this to Martha initially. Observing pattern in wind noise seemed like the kind of thing that sleep deprivation and confinement could create through suggestion, rather than through actual external phenomenon, and mentioning it might cause Martha to hear pattern too through the power of expectation, rather than through actual presence of pattern. He continued to listen, continued to try to determine if what he was hearing was real or was artifact of his mental state. But around 2 a.m, Martha spoke quietly from where she lay beside him. She said she could not sleep, said the wind was bothering her more than it should, said something about it seemed wrong, though she could not identify what wrong meant. Daniel asked her what seemed wrong about it. Martha hesitated, then said the wind sounded like it was trying to say something, like there were words in it if you listened carefully enough, like the randomness of the sound was not quite random enough. Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the cabin. Martha had independently observed what he had been observing. They listened together in the darkness. The sounds continued through the remainder of the second night. Daniel and Martha slept little, spent most of the hours listening, trying to understand what they were hearing, trying to determine if they were experiencing something real, or if they were both being affected by the same psychological pressures that confinement and exhaustion created. By morning of February 10th, they were both deeply unsettled, but could not point to anything specific that had occurred beyond wind-making noise that seemed to have pattern. They did not discuss their observations with the children, did not want to create fear or suggestion that might make the children hear things that might not be there. The third day, February 10th, brought no moderation in the storm. If anything, the wind seemed stronger, seemed more sustained, seemed less like normal storm wind and more like wind that had purpose beyond simply being movement of air, from a high pressure to low pressure. The family remained confined, remained listening to wind that now seemed wrong to both parents, even during daylight, when psychological effects of darkness were absent, and prepared for a third night with increasing dread about what that third night might bring. The third night, February 10th into February 11th, was the night when whatever had been building through the previous 2 nights reached its peak intensity, and when the Patterson family experienced whatever it was they experienced that made remaining in the hollow impossible afterward. The speaking began around 10 in the evening, shortly after the family had settled for the night. The wind that had been blowing strongly all day intensified further, and the sounds it made shifted from the whistling and howling that had characterized the previous nights to sounds that had more complexity, more variation, more of what could be described as articulation. Both Daniel and Martha heard it. Both of them lay in the darkness, listening to sounds that seemed to be coming from multiple directions, from outside the walls, from within the walls, from the hollow itself. The children heard it too. Samuel, the oldest at 13, asked his parents what the voices were. Rebecca asked who was talking outside. William asked why the walls were making speaking sounds. Even Anna, at 4 years old, seemed disturbed by sounds that were wrong in ways that very young children could detect, even when they could not articulate what wrong meant. Daniel tried to explain to the children that it was wind, that wind moving through gaps could make many kinds of sounds, that what they were hearing was natural, even if it was unsettling. But even as he provided these explanations, he did not believe them himself. The speaking continued through the night. It did not remain constant. It would intensify for periods that might last 20 minutes or an hour, creating sounds that were so clearly speech-like that ignoring the impression became impossible, and then it would fade into more normal wind sounds before building again into another cycle of apparent speech. Around 2 in the morning, the sounds changed again. The speech-like noises that had been coming from outside the cabin and from within the walls began to seem like they were responding to each other, like multiple sources were creating sounds in ways that related to what other sources were creating. Daniel listened to sounds from outside the north wall that would rise and fall in sequence, and then sounds from within the east wall that would respond with their own rise and fall, and then sounds from outside the south side that would continue the exchange, creating the unmistakable impression of voices speaking to each other. Martha, lying beside Daniel in the darkness, while their children huddled together across the room, whispered that she wanted to leave. Daniel whispered back that leaving was not possible, that the storm outside would kill them faster than the sounds inside could harm them, that they had to remain in the cabin until the storm ended. So they remained. They listened through the remainder of the third night. By morning of February 11th, the storm had moderated. The family remained inside, through the day, exhausted from 3 nights of minimal sleep. By evening of February 11th, the wind had diminished enough that the sounds were merely wind sounds. The family slept that night, slept deeply from exhaustion. On the morning of February 12th, Daniel looked outside and determined that travel was possible. He made the decision that the family would leave, permanently. Martha agreed immediately. The children agreed that they did not want to stay in the hollow anymore. The family gathered what they could carry: clothing, a few essential items, nothing that would slow travel through snow that was still deep, and left the cabin on the morning of February 12th, walking away from their home and walking toward the trail that would take them out of the hollow and toward the nearest settlement, where they could seek shelter and where they could begin the process of explaining why they had abandoned their property. The journey to the nearest neighbors, a family named Morrison, who lived approximately 3 miles from the Patterson Hollow, took most of the day through snow and cold. When the Pattersons arrived at the Morrison homestead, exhausted and carrying children who could barely walk further, they were taken in, were given food and warmth, and were asked what had happened to cause them to leave their property in the middle of winter, carrying almost nothing. Daniel and Martha tried to explain. They described the storm, described the 3 nights of confinement, described the sounds that the wind had made during those nights, and particularly during the 3rd night. They described how the sounds had affected them, how they could not return to the place where they had heard what they had heard. The Morrisons listened, tried to understand, tried to determine if what the Pattersons were describing was real phenomenon or was psychological breakdown created by storm confinement and by exhaustion. Frank Morrison offered to go to the Patterson Hollow to check the cabin, to see if anything there would explain what the family had experienced. 3 days later, on February 15th, Frank Morrison and 2 other men traveled to the Patterson Hollow. They found the cabin intact, found it exactly as the Pattersons had left it. The men spent several hours examining it and listening to the wind. They heard normal wind sounds, whistling through gaps, creaking of wood. But they did not hear speaking. They could not reproduce or detect what the Pattersons had described. Morrison reported back that the cabin seemed normal, that he could find no explanation for what they had experienced. He suggested gently that perhaps storm stress and confinement had created perceptions not based on external phenomena. He suggested that the family might reconsider their decision once they had rested. But Daniel and Martha refused. They insisted that what they had heard was real, that it was not hallucination, and that returning to the hollow was not possible. The Patterson family never returned to their hollow. They remained with the Morrisons, temporarily and eventually relocated to a different area where they established a new homestead in terrain that was open rather than enclosed. The children eventually recovered from the experience, though they retained memories of the night when the wind spoke. The Patterson Hollow was avoided by others who knew the story. The cabin stood empty for years, gradually deteriorating, and the property was never reclaimed. We have reached the end of this journey through one of the Ozark Plateau's most disturbing episodes of environmental psychological horror. A family who spent 3 nights listening to wind that seemed to speak, who heard sounds that exceeded what physics alone should create, and who left their hollow permanently, because what they heard during those 3 nights convinced them that remaining in the place where such sounds originated was impossible, even though leaving meant abandoning everything they had built, and even though they could not explain to others what they had heard in ways that would make their fear seem justified. If you've made it this far on this journey through territory, where wind makes sounds that seem to have purpose, and where hollows channel wind in ways that create acoustic phenomena that exceed normal explanation, consider subscribing to Commute Tales for more stories that explore the boundaries between natural phenomenon and something else. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on what the Pattersons might have heard in their hollow. And if this story resonated with you, a like helps bring these narratives to more people. Until our next journey, remember that somewhere in the Ozark Plateau, there is a hollow where a family once listened to wind that spoke through walls, where sounds seemed to have pattern and purpose beyond what random turbulence should create, and where 3 nights of listening convinced them that staying meant enduring sounds that exceeded weather, and that made the distinction between storm and something else impossible to maintain, leaving only an empty cabin and a hollow that travelers still avoid when wind is strong.